Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today, we are continuing our Timely, Tough, or Tricky Physician Compensation and Fair Market Value Topics series with a presentation on navigating hospital-based specialty financial arrangements. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing a message into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them via email after the webinar, and all of our webinars are recorded and released with a copy of the slides after the event. With that, I would like to introduce Carden and Lyle Oelrich, principals at PYA.
Thank you, Trevor. Good morning, everyone. Hope your day is off to a fantastic start. My name is Lyle Oelrich, and I would like to welcome you all to another Timely, Tough, or Tricky webinar as a part of this series on hot topics in physician compensation and fair market value in 2023. Today, we are talking about a topic PYA has helped hundreds of clients deal with, and one that we get a lot of questions about on a regular basis, that of hospital-based specialty financial arrangements. More specifically, as we progress today in our presentation, we'll be sharing several key trends in this area, as well as best practices and pitfalls to avoid along the way. Now, that being said, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. First, as a quick reminder that the discussion today will focus on general educational topics, and so nothing we talk about is intended to issue an opinion, which would be based off of a specific set of facts and circumstances. Second, we will be asking for your participation during our discussion today by answering a couple of quick multiple choice questions, and you'll need your phone to do so, so please grab it and have it handy, and I'll share more information on this topic here in just a few moments. To talk about this subject today, I'm super excited to be joined by my colleague and partner, Carden. Carol is a principal and leads our compensation valuation planning and design department. She is located in Knoxville and has over 25 years of experience. She's also a regular presenter and author on a variety of physician compensation and fair market value topics to a multitude of different organizations, such as the American Health Lawyers Association. As for myself, and for those that I've not yet met participating today, I am also a principal in our compensation valuation planning and design department. Like Carol, I'm located in Knoxville. I have 25 years of experience and regularly speak and write on a variety of physician compensation, fair market value, and economic alignment topics as well. So to begin our discussion today, we wanted to share the results of a poll that was taken at the beginning of the year. Some of you all who have participated in this Triple T series are probably familiar with this, but it's what we're using to organize our Triple T webinar series this year. And as you can see, we surveyed 50 experts about physician compensation and fair market value topics that they are dealing with here. And you'll see the top 10 that was the result of that particular poll. You'll see APPs actually were in the top 5 twice from a couple of different ways. The end of the public health emergency, the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, call coverage, medical directors, management services, then benchmark data in 2023, value-based comp models, and then hospital-based specialty financial arrangements as well. Of course, number 10 we're talking about here today. Also, previously, the last couple of months, we addressed the end of the public health emergency and the 2023 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. I'll ask the moderator at this point, if you all have interest in the public health and the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, I'll ask the moderator to chat in a link to the Triple T webinar series where you'll find those two, as well as 6 or 7 topics that we talked about in this series in 2022, in the event you want to revisit that in the future. So to start our conversation today, we wanted to lay the foundation for what we mean when we say hospital-based specialty financial arrangements. And these are arrangements between hospitals and health systems with hospital-based specialty groups when compensation generally is, but is not always, exchanged between the two parties. In our experience, we typically find these arrangements in specialties such as hospitalist, anesthesia, radiology, critical care, emergency medicine, and others such as neonatology and pathology, just to name a few. As to why these are needed, generally there aren't sufficient collections to generate fair market value compensation for the providers for a number of reasons. There's several that are on this slide, not necessarily all comprehensive or all inclusive, but regarding the 24-hour nature of services, as well as the coverage requirements, sort of bullet points on this slide, there in a lot of instances may only be a few patients to see, perhaps during a shift or a 24-hour period, which translates into relatively little revenue. But given the 24-hour nature of the services or the specific requirements, you may have to provide full staffing, and so you have all of those expenses that come along with the coverage or the 24-hour nature. On the payer mix, just briefly, generally greater than 50% Medicare and Medicaid from a payer mix perspective would be an indication that financial assistance may be needed. But there are some market-specific limitations to that particular statement as well. Of course, increasing cost, in some instances declining reimbursement, or at least reimbursement not keeping up with the level or the rise of the increasing costs. We'll get into a few examples here in just a moment that I'll share with you some specifics on that to give it a little bit more meaning to it. But before we jump into some of the trends we wanted to go over today, earlier I mentioned we would be asking for some audience participation and to have your cameras ready. So wanted to kind of start the direction of our conversation today by having a poll. And so to participate, if you'll take your phone out and you'll aim your camera at the QR code, and then there should be a link that appears, and you can follow that link and it'll take you directly to answer this particular poll. And alternatively, you can go to slido.com and enter the event code, which is 1862442. Some of you all are already getting the hang of this. And enter the code where it says enter the code here if you want to use the internet versus your phone. So here, which hospital-based specialty have you seen the greatest increase in financial assistance over the last 1 to 2 years? Looks like 26 respondents have already weighed in here, but as we await people to continue to answer the question, I think we've seen movement in all of these specialties. However, with a lot of hospitalists, interestingly enough, as this one appears to be at the top, we see fewer of those from a valuation perspective because a lot of those hospitalists are employed. But certainly the financial assistance, whether it's through the employment of physicians or directly to perhaps a private practice group, can come into play as well. But where we have seen some real supply and demand issues, we're seeing a lot of movement in anesthesia and, interestingly enough, ED, which appears to be towards the end of this particular poll as well. And, there's a lot of reasons that we're seeing that. Really, some of it's being offset as well as we think about the amount being paid by some close reviews of sites of service and coverage requirements, such as perhaps if it's anesthesia, needing a CRNA versus an anesthesiologist for a specific site of service. But really appreciate you all participating in the poll here. Again, as you can see, the majority of the respondents, looks like there's a sample size of 37. Hospitalists followed by anesthesiologists has seen the greatest increase in financial assistance over the last 1 to 2 years.
I'm a little surprised by that, Lyle, honestly, just based on some of the client assignments I've worked on recently. Anesthesiology has really been a challenge for a lot of providers. So that's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, real interesting as well. But again, thanks to everybody for participating. So as I mentioned earlier, overall, generally expenses are increasing and revenue is remaining relatively flat. And in some instances, as I mentioned, declining for certain hospital-based specialties, and certainly at least not keeping up with the increase in expenses. So you'll see several items on this slide that are changing in the directions that I describe here. However, I wanted to share a few that we've seen from the clients that we've worked with, most notably over the last 12 to 18 months. Perhaps you're seeing them, perhaps you haven't, and you may see them. This might give you a little extra time to prepare. But for example, we've seen some commercial payers approaching hospital-based specialties with 40+% declines in reimbursement. And that's a real number that these commercial payers are presenting to hospital-based specialties. We've seen some advanced practice practitioner costs in hospital-based settings increasing 30% or more in some markets over the last, I'd say 12 to 18 months, as I mentioned. Health insurance continues to be a challenge as you provide that for your employees, 20+% per year. And then cybersecurity insurance and some of the things around there, we've seen increasing north of 50% per year. So these are real difficulties that physician practices are encountering as they're trying to provide this hospital-based arrangements. Another trend that we've seen is the shift from inpatient to outpatient care. And by way of example, just a couple of quick statistics. There was a recent Guidehouse Center for Health Insights that surveyed over 180 hospital and healthcare system C-suite individuals. 17% of those executives expect decreases of more than 10% in inpatient volumes in 2023. And 95% of executives project higher outpatient volumes in 2023, which you might expect, but over 40% of those executives are anticipating increases of 10% or more. And I really think that that's significant, because what that means in the context of hospital-based specialties is that inpatient volume declines and outpatient volumes increase. Yet in a lot of instances, the 24-hour nature of inpatient services remains intact. More financial assistance may be needed if the inpatient sites of service or the coverage requirements don't change. And in some instances, that's what we're seeing in certain markets. And so it's creating a real challenge for providers. This next trend might leave you scratching your head a little bit initially as you think about hospital-based subsidies, but let me try to give it a little bit more context. Again, this is the concept moving sort of from physicians moving from private practice to physician employment. And with rising expenses and revenue, just like we've been talking about here over the last few minutes, frankly, many physicians are throwing in the towel where they can. And again, we've got the corporate practice of medicine doctrine that we've got to keep in mind here. And they're leaving private independent practices for employment by hospitals and health systems. And depending on what statistics you see, it may be as much as 70%, maybe even more, of physicians now being employed by hospitals and health systems. So this is a big trend. And so as I think about and as I process these statistics along with what we're seeing in the market, what this means is that more and more physicians who have tried to manage their practices literally to the best of their ability just can't do it anymore. And so the rise in the expenses combined with the continued reimbursement pressures have led physicians to seek higher financial assistance from hospitals where they can. But if they can't, physicians are then turning to hospital employment to get out of sort of the administrative or the managing side of the business. And this includes hospital-based specialties. This is not just a sort of an outpatient-based perspective here. One final trend that I'm going to cover very quickly before I pass the baton to Carol. I want to talk a little bit about private equity entering in the market. So as you can see here on this slide, over the 4-year time span leading up to 2017 and then the 4 years after 2017, private equity acquisitions have grown by 163%. That's a very significant number. And these include acquisitions of all specialties. You'll see 12% here for ED, 20% for anesthesia, and there are other hospital-based specialties that are in this 68%. But as these acquisitions continue to occur, private equity is going to be looking for a return on their investment. And in a hospital-based setting, if they can't squeeze any expenses out, and if they can't effectively negotiate higher managed care contract rates to obtain their required internal rate of returns, they're going to be approaching hospitals for larger amounts of financial assistance. And just as one quick example, not too long ago, we witnessed one private equity firm approach a hospital for a 300% increase in financial assistance. And now, while that's a little bit abnormal from what we typically see, and let me be clear, ultimately it didn't occur, the transaction didn't occur at that level, private equity is definitely looking for a return on their investment. And so that's a new element that's coming into the market. So let me pause there. I want to pass the baton to Carol. She's going to pick up on a few more trends and then talk a little bit about some of the pitfalls and best practices as well.
Thanks, Lyle. So the next trend we're going to talk about is the No Surprises Act, which Lyle had noted on an earlier slide as one of the contributors to decreases in reimbursement. And if you're not extremely familiar with the No Surprises Act, we have provided a link at the bottom of this slide to a white paper that'll go much more in depth than we will on this webinar. But generally, it's going to apply to all of these hospital-based specialties that we're talking about today. And what has happened historically is that the practice piece of these services weren't necessarily in network with all the same plans that the hospital might have been in network with. So what would happen is a patient might present to the emergency room and think that they're in network and then get a bill from the emergency physician group who wasn't in network and get charged a higher rate. So what the No Surprises Act was intended to do basically is eliminate those types of surprises for patients. So generally speaking, when the No Surprises Act applies, you can't charge patients more than what their in-network cost sharing would have been, and you have to provide them a good faith estimate on the front end. So physician practices who historically might have had an out-of-network strategy as part of how they manage their payer relationships can't really take advantage of that anymore. So we actually had an anesthesiology client say that the No Surprises Act kind of effectively puts an end to kind of the modern way that anesthesiology practices have acted or have operated. So if you think about it, if we've had subsidies for these various specialties previously, even when they were able to implement an out-of-network strategy for some of the payers, and then that strategy goes away, then the obvious thing that's probably going to happen is the revenues are going to decline and they're going to come to the hospital in need of greater subsidies. So one of the things when we have a client approach us to look at a subsidy on their behalf, particularly if the group has requested an increase, that's one of the first things we ask is, are they being impacted by the No Surprises Act? One of the reasons we ask that is because in theory, that may be something that the practice can remedy. It's not something they can generally fix immediately, but it may be if they've had that strategy in the past and now know that that strategy is not effective any longer, then perhaps you only lock in the subsidy for 1 year and give the group time to go in network with some of these and try to negotiate better rates so that maybe over time you might initially have to agree to a higher subsidy, but maybe over time you can work it down as they get better relationships with some of the payers. So what this slide shows is basically what we've been talking about. This is from the MGMA cost survey, but just showing how the average stipend, and this is for anesthesiology only, but how the average stipend for a hospital has changed over the years. And you can obviously see a trajectory line there that none of us probably think is sustainable if it continues in that direction. But just to give some context to what's driving this for anesthesiology, if you looked at MGMA, AMGA, and Sullivan Cotter on average, in 2018, the median compensation for an anesthesiologist was $430,000 and collections were $453,000. But if you look at those same three groups of surveys in 2022, the median compensation is $443,000, which is a 3% increase, which is completely reasonable over a 4-year period, but the collections have declined 6% in that same time frame. So as you can imagine, that's creating a gap. And if we think back to Lyle's earlier comments on the whole reason that we end up doing financial assistance and subsidy arrangements is to allow the practice to be able to pay their physicians at a fair market value rate. Well, if the fair market value comp has gone up and the collections are going down, then the obvious thing that's probably going to happen is they're going to be asking the hospital to pitch in a little bit more than maybe they did in the past. So with that, we're going to go to our second polling question. And just as a quick reminder, as Lyle said, scan the QR code, should take you directly to the poll, or go to slido.com and enter the 1862442 number. So this question, for which specialty are you paying the most in financial assistance? And I'll be interested to see the answers to this, because I think a couple of years ago, my experience with the clients that I've worked with might have said emergency room is where we saw the biggest one. But given some of the changes in anesthesiology that we've been talking about in here, I'm not surprised to see that as of right now, at least, anesthesiology is leading the pack. Because anesthesiology is in particular getting a double whammy of No Surprises Act impact, and at least in a lot of markets that we've worked in, significant changes in the CRNA compensation. So we'll give a few more minutes for people to weigh in, although I'm not sure anyone's going to catch anesthesiology at this point. Looks like it's slowed down there. So yeah, by and large, anesthesiology is where people are feeling the pain, the most pain right now. And there's a couple of things in our best practices that we're about to cover that might specifically help for anesthesiology in particular. So let's talk about some of those. So best practices, and this will apply to any of these arrangements, but I'll point out a couple of places where it may be more specific to anesthesiology, just to help those of you who work for providers or are advising providers. So monitoring billing and collection performance. So what we don't want to see is we don't want to see the hospital paying a larger subsidy because the practice has poor billing performance or isn't really incentivized to have industry kind of best practice billing performance. Just for some context, if you look at the MGMA cost survey for these hospital-based specialties we've been discussing, other than emergency room, which is not reported, the adjusted collection ratio generally ranges from 92 to 96%. So we like to see some kind of stipulation in the agreement that holds them to some level of industry standard billing performance that the hospital can see, statistics about at the end of the year, so that they know they're not subsidizing poor billing practices by the group. Reconciliation, this is something we always recommend as a best practice, certainly on the revenue side at a minimum. And again, if you think back to Lyle's earlier slide, the reason we have subsidies is to make sure that physicians can earn fair market value compensation. So if that subsidy is based on a particular assumption of revenue and the collections turn out to be much higher, you could inadvertently end up if you don't reconcile, you could end up in a situation where you inadvertently might have paid more than fair market value just because you didn't reconcile the terms of the agreement. Regular staffing assessments, this comes at these arrangements a couple of different ways. We certainly want to see If there are going to be increases in staffing in the agreements, once they're executed, that the hospital has to be on board with that and agree to that. So we don't want to see a situation where a practice can go hire additional people so their physicians have a smaller workload and the hospital doesn't have any input into that. So we'd like to see, you know, volumes have increased or anesthetizing locations have been added to impact that staffing. But the other thing specific to anesthesia that we want to look at in terms of how staffing might affect the subsidy is, generally speaking, and a lot of this depends, you know, very specifically on the anesthetizing locations of the facility, but generally speaking, we like to see a staffing ratio in anesthesia of 1 physician to 3 CRNAs or 4 CRNAs. That's kind of an ideal one. We actually were just dealing with a client a week or so ago whose anesthesia group came to them with a significant requested increase. And one of the questions that we ask in that is we ask about the staffing complement. And not only did this group not have a 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, they actually had a 4 or 5 physicians to 1 CRNA staffing. So their staffing ratio was completely flipped. Now, there can be some reasons for that. But it's certainly something that we're encouraging the hospital to explore with the group, because as you can imagine, having a ratio like that's going to result in a much more expensive staffing complement than if you're able to leverage down more to CRNAs. So for those of you that said you've seen your biggest increases in anesthesiology, there's one place to kind of ask some questions and make sure that the group is using the most efficient staffing complement. Having dollars at risk for quality, this is something that's become, you know, pretty much industry standard at this point, but we still want to see it as kind of a best practice in there. And then we just like to see governors on the agreement, performance metrics or things that can be tracked to make sure that financially and operationally the agreement stays consistent with what the parties' intent was when they negotiated it. And then contrary to that, kind of pitfalls to avoid, and some of these are the exact opposite of what we just talked about, but pitfalls to avoid, of course, financially paying for a group's poor billing and collection performance. We don't want to see that. Staffing ratios we talked about, in general, but also in particular to anesthesiology. Not monitoring the agreement or not reconciling. This happens quite a bit, surprisingly. It kind of gets negotiated and then it gets set to the side, and you get 2 or 3 years down the road and realize that the revenues were never reconciled, even though the agreement called for that. And you end up in a situation where the practice owes money back, and that's just a bad situation. It's bad from a compliance standpoint, but it's also bad from a physician relationship standpoint. So we definitely don't want to see that. We want to kind of keep these on the radar screen so the terms of the agreement are being monitored and adhered to. Subsidizing unusual profit margins. So sometimes we'll actually see the profit margin called out specifically in the proposed financial assistance from the group. That's not in and of itself a bad thing, but we don't want to see, most of our hospital clients right now, unfortunately, are probably losing money on operations. But even when they were making money on operations, it was a pretty slim margin. So you don't want to see necessarily, a hospital who can make 2 or 3% on operations, including a 15 or 20% profit margin and the subsidy. That from a commercial reasonableness standpoint would be a little bit hard, I think, to justify. To the extent there are administrative functions in these agreements, which is pretty common, either not monitoring or documenting, not to say that you always have to have timesheets for the administrative function, but you do want some way to know that you actually received those services, whether it's attendance at various meetings or milestones that you might have set in terms of like administrative achievements. So we like to see some manner of making sure that those services are actually being provided. And then this last one has really, in the last few years, been a big deal, not accounting for regulatory changes. So we saw when COVID happened, not that that was a regulatory change, but we had a lot of clients realize they had no way to quickly flex anything about their agreements. And then we saw it again with the 2021 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. So it's kind of a pitfall to avoid. We've seen a lot of clients put language in their agreements now that say something to the effect if there's significant changes in Medicare or the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule or other regulations, that gives them a chance to go back to the table. So we definitely don't want to see clients in a situation where they can't adjust when something really significant happens in the industry. And then it's just kind of a closing thought, negotiating within a range. So fair market value is generally a range. So therefore, the financial assistance calculation is also usually a range. So we want it to be wide enough to allow for some negotiation of the various components that are included, but we don't want it so wide that the hospital can't really effectively make a business decision. It's kind of the same concept as when we come up with our fair market value range. So we want it tight enough that it's specific to the fair market value that we're analyzing, and not so wide that it's just two data points that aren't really representative of fair market value. So we like to see a similar kind of thoughtful process in the range where the financial assistance amount is being determined as well. So that's what we have for today. Lyle, do you want me to turn it back over to you?
Carol, we'll turn it to the moderator to wrap it up.
Right.
Thanks to our presenters, Lyle and Carol. If you have any questions, their presentation and contact information will be emailed to you, along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, call or email us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details about our specific areas of expertise, or to subscribe to receive PYA insights. On behalf of PYA, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.